So let me just start by making my claim that I think multitasking is part of a much larger phenomenon that I call invisible work. This is the work that your colleagues don't see, your manager doesn't see. It's the extra effort that people have to do, that information workers have to do just to keep up with the demands of their jobs. Now, people often ask me, how did you ever start thinking about multitasking? It actually comes from my own experience, because as Stu mentioned, before coming to UCI, I was working in Germany at a research lab, and I called it a life of luxury. Why? Because I didn't have to teach, I didn't have to write grant proposals, I didn't have to sit on committees, I didn't have to do task forces. All I had to do was do my research. Came to UCI in 2000, landed in academia. What did I have to do? I had to teach, I had to mentor students, write grants, do committee work, all these kinds of things. And I found myself multitasking like crazy. I looked around me, I saw everybody else multitasking. And probably the best illustration of the difference between these two lives was that when I lived in Germany, my colleagues would go out to eat as a group. We'd have a nice big lunch. You know, you have your main meal of the day in Germany at lunchtime. And then we'd go for a 20-minute walk around the campus and then go back to work. Come to UCI, and I'm running after my class, you know, grab something, some fast food to eat, racing back to my office and seeing all the open office doors and seeing all my colleagues sitting in front of their computers eating their lunch. So I began to wonder, to what extent do other people experience this kind of frenetic lifestyle? So why do people multitask? Well, we really don't know, but here's some reasons why I think that people might multitask. There's individual reasons. There is work that shows that there are preferences for multitasking. Some people prefer to do what's called polychronic work, doing multiple tasks at the same time. Most people, like myself, the vast majority, prefer monochronic work, which is completing one task through to completion before starting on something else. Now, the thing is that it's the demands of our workplace, it's the lifestyle, the work style we're in, that doesn't allow people to do monochronic work. There are, of course, technological reasons. The adoption of different devices in our workplace allows us to access information, switch between tasks very easily. And of course, there's organizational reasons. I would maintain, for example, over the years, there's research that shows that the scope of work has increased, that work roles have expanded. Imagine the startup where the person working the startup wears multiple hats. And of course, as I keep emphasizing, people are just reacting to the demands of the workplace. You're kind of caught up in this multitasking system. You're not an isolated individual. Now, this is what an office looked like in 1911. And what I find interesting about this picture is that people had different devices in their workplace, and when they switched tasks, they actually had to go to a different device. This looks to me like some kind of adding machine. This is a typewriter. We have here, looks like a log book. So people actually had to physically move to switch tasks. And of course, the workplace of today, we have all these, the ability to do all these different tasks can be basically changed at the press of a button or a click. So it's very, very easy to switch. And of course, we're seduced by email. You know, when that email icon comes on, you know, people are just compelled to answer. I call it the Las Vegas phenomenon, right? You're always looking for that hit, right? Like playing the slot machines, and it just might be that keynote speaking invitation or that email from your long lost lover. You never know what's going to happen. So the first question that I set out to try to understand is what is the nature of multitasking in the workplace? And my study is confined to information workers, people whose primary task deals with information. So this means I'm not looking at people who work in retail, I'm not looking at people who work in some areas of manufacturing. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about how we collected our data. So bear with me for just a couple of slides, because the rest of the results that I'm going to tell you will make a lot more sense when put into the context of how we collected the data. We did field work, which means that we sent people out into actual companies and observed how people did their work. I'll tell you in a moment how we did that. In looking, these were the field sites that we used. They were all field sites where people were information workers. When we were looking for field sites, we developed a set of criteria. We wanted people to be involved in multiple projects with different levels of engagement. That was really easy. Technology-rich environments, again, very easy. Fast-paced environments, deadlines, pressure, again, nearly all the places we considered, I would say every place we considered fit these criteria. The last one was difficult. Finding a place where people were willing to be observed at the level of detail that we wanted to observe people. Now, if you walked into any of these field sites, the impression that you had was that they were really fast-paced. It was quite frenetic. You had the sense that there was high pressure. Not all of our informants, but quite a few worked in open office environments or cubicle farms. And in these cubicle farms, you frequently heard chatting through the walls, right? People didn't get up and walk to a different cubicle. They would just simply talk and stay in their cubicle. Okay, so here's the methodology. Here's how we collected our data. So we began with having the observer go into a workplace and spend 10 days hanging around. In other words, doing an ethnographic kind of observation to try to learn about the context of the work of the organization. Then, for each informant, the observer spent 3.5 days observing this person, and what they would do was essentially sit with that person in their cubicle or in their office, follow them around, and they essentially had a stopwatch. And they timed every single activity to the second. So, someone gets a phone call, that's the start time. Put the phone down, it's the stop time. Right, someone switches to working on a Word document, start time, then they switch to look at a spreadsheet, stop time, and then they're starting on the Excel spreadsheet. So, these observers, it was quite labor intensive. Actually, now we've equipped offices with sensors. I'll talk about that at the end of the talk. We waited until the end of the day before making any kind of clarifications. We didn't want the observer to be a source of interruptions. We did pre and post interviews after observations, took photos of the work area, and to the extent that it was possible, wasn't always possible because of the fast-paced nature, the observer would try to write down details of what was going on, like what was being done, who was present, what people were talking about. Wasn't always possible. Now, we did this for actually 35 different informants. I'll talk about that shortly. And as you might imagine, we accumulated just a vast amount of data. What do you do with all this data, right? It's just single events that are logged. Well, we decided to code the events. We used a definition based on Lee Sproul. She's a researcher in organizational behavior. And she defined an event as where neither the structure nor the content changes. we modified this definition a little bit to the amount of time that people spent in continuous, uninterrupted use of a device or engagement in an interaction with other individuals. A telephone call is an event. Working on a Word document, right? Things like that, chatting through the cubicle wall. People were in a variety of work roles, so we didn't just have software developers or managers, but people were in a variety of roles, which we felt helps us in generalizing our results beyond just any particular work role. Okay, so now, does anyone have any questions on the data collection method before I go into results? Okay, yes?
It sounds like there's an assumption you're never actually doing two things simultaneously.
Yeah, it's a myth to think that people are actually parallel processing. You're switching rapidly, and the observer would try to capture, to the extent they could, this switching. So if you're on a phone call and typing, you make the assumption that if you're typing, you're really not, your attention is not on that phone call, right? It didn't happen that much, but it happened, and so we had to the best that the observer could. Now, when I show you some of the results, you'll see that even if there were a few seconds error, it's not going to make a lot of difference in the results. Yes?
So, kind of going on that note, I mean, a lot of people drive and text message call, which we should be doing, of course, but we do. So, isn't that simultaneous action?
Well, it is simultaneous action for if you're observing it. When you're driving, you're kind of on automatic, right? And you snap into sort of attention or heightened awareness if some event happens, someone swerves in front of you, right? That's why one of the dangers of cell phone use when you're driving is that the caller cannot see the road, right? So they don't stop talking, they keep going. If you have a passenger in the car, they see that event, and they all of a sudden stop because they know that the driver needs full attention, right? Okay. So let me start by first comparing the data of an information worker in pre and post email errors. Now, the Surf IT students, I know that you grew up with email. How about the rest of you? Who grew up without email? I know I grew up without email, okay? So you Surf IT students probably don't know what I'm talking about. I tried to collect studies where people did time management. Now, no one has ever collected data at the level of detail that we did. But what people have done is they've looked at how people distributed their time over the workday. So we could use that data and compare our results with it. Now, I want you to look at this chart, and these two columns here were done in a post-email era. That is when most organizations were using email for conducting business. In 1992, it was kind of iffy. Some organizations were using email, but a lot of them, it really wasn't their primary means of communication. And so what I want you to do is I want you to look at this table and tell me if you see anything interesting. What kind of conclusions might you make, Steve?
Well, there seems to be a radical drop in unscheduled meetings from 65 to 2007. And one sort of has to wonder whether some of those activities are manifest in what might be called desk work, in other words, communicating with people electronically. Okay, right, you got it. Now, this is an anomaly here, but if you don't look at this particular, and you look at, well, actually, it's more the scheduled meetings, right? This is what's the anomaly, and this is quite a high percentage of the day, right, spent in scheduled formal meetings versus the post-email era, right?
So focus on these two columns, and again, look at desk work, right? Look at the change in the percentage of time people spent at desk work, right? So we have two things going on. Proportion of time spent in desk work nearly doubled in post-email, and people spent less proportion of their day in formal face-to-face meetings. So what does that suggest to you, putting these two ideas together? What's the obvious
You're tied to your
conclusion?
computer.
Pardon me?
You're tied to your computer.
Well, you're tied to your computer, but the work previously done at formal meetings might well be now done at the desktop, in particular maybe through email. Now let's talk about, yes?
What about the advent of teleconferencing?
Right. It could also have been done through, I mean, teleconferencing could also be a reason for that as well.
It seemed like
Yes.
it's kind of like a third thing,
Yeah,
almost.
it could also be. In our companies, there was very little video conferencing. There was audio conferencing, so it could have been to audio conferencing, but audio conferencing also existed pre-email. So Skype came about later. Now, of course, you know, if we did the study again, Skype might be a contributing factor. So, how fragmented is work, which means how often do people actually switch tasks? So remember when we coded events, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the data based on the coding of each individual event. First, let me just show you a map of two different individuals' days, just to kind of show you what things are like in the course of the day. We have these different symbols. Ignore that for a moment. I'm not going to spend time talking about it. I don't know if you can see this very clearly back there, but this represents switching, and the horizontal spends the amount of time spent in a continuous task. And you'll notice that around lunchtime, of course, you have a long period of time, but you have a lot of rapid switching, right, throughout the rest of the day. So what we did was we looked at the average amount of time that people spent on various events, and I'm going to switch back because I know you're all very good mathematicians and you can very quickly compute this. And if you know, don't say the answer. What do you think is the average amount of time that our informants spent on any particular event before switching? Remember, it's three days of data collection, so we're taking an average over 3 days. If one day was anomalous, you know, we presumably got enough other data that we could get a good, yeah.
2 to 3 minutes.
2 to 3 minutes. Anyone else? No one else? Okay. Well, you're very close. It's actually 3 minutes and 5 seconds. And this result is very robust because we've done additional data collection, and it always kind of revolves around the 3-minute mark. We did I had a student, Norman Sue, who collected data, and he did this on 19 informants and came up with 2 minutes and 59 seconds on average. So it seems to be a very robust result. That people spend about 3 minutes on average on any event, I'm going to call it event for the moment, before switching or being interrupted. Okay. We also looked at how often people switch devices. And these were the different kinds of devices. We're including paper documents as a device, books, manuals. Essentially, this is the data minus the interaction with people. So we're just taking the interaction with people except for phone use. And we find here that it's an average of 2 minutes and 11 seconds that people spend on any device before switching. Now, from those of you who are interested in human-computer interaction interface design, this is a really important result because it tells us that we need to think about designing interfaces for people to be able to enter in quickly, right? There's not a lot of startup time. People switch very quickly. Yes?
Are these related to the same how are they related to whether it's the same task or different task?
I'm going to get to that in just a moment. Okay, I think you're asking not just at the event, but at the project level.
Right.
Yes, I'm going to get to that. So hold on. Okay. In fact, I'm going to talk about it right now. So I'm going to talk about projects. So then we asked the question, well, maybe it's not so bad to switch so fast if you're working on the same project, right? If you're working in the same context, you know, imagine you're writing a paper, right? We're in academia. Maybe it doesn't matter if you on a telephone call with someone about the paper, you're typing on a Word document, you're searching for literature, because it's all the same context. So here's what we did. We took those events and we tried to categorize these events into what we called working spheres. We defined a working sphere as a set of interrelated events, shares a common goal, involves communication with a particular set of people, has unique resources, has its own time framework. You can think of it as a project, but we don't like to use the word project because it's a little bit broader. People have a particular connotation of a project as being somewhat formal, but a working sphere can even be informal. It's a sphere of work. It can involve your family, it can involve home. So people, our informants, had no trouble identifying their projects, like the TGX project, or their ClearQuest app, or their task force. So they had no problem. We presented them with what we thought were their working spheres and validated it with them, and they had no trouble recognizing it. How did we do it? Well, it was very, very labor intensive. And I'm not going to go through this, but we used a lot of different sources of information to try to categorize those events into their respective working spheres. And despite the fact, with all this careful attention, there were still about 11% of events that just could not be categorized. So, you know, we just couldn't, and rather than error of putting them in the wrong working sphere, we just did not categorize them. And here's what we found. We found that people worked in an average of 12.2 different working spheres, but they switched, and this goes to answer your question, they spent about 10.5 minutes in any working sphere before switching. Now, I argue that's not a lot of time. Imagine writing a paper. It takes me about 10.5 minutes just to orient myself to the paper, and then I'm switching. Now, we thought there's all kinds of interruptions, right? You can have, you know, I can be working on something, someone comes into my office and says, can I have your signature? Well, for me, you know, doing my signature is automatic. And maybe that's just not a significant shift in context for me. On the other hand, what happens if someone comes into my office and says, I really need your help on, you know, I have this problem, you know, software developers reported that they had someone who asked them to help debug something. That's a significant interruption. So my student and I sat there and we tried to figure out, okay, how long would be a significant interruption? And we were just playing around with the data, and we decided 2 minutes. You know, we sat there timing 2 minutes. We said, yeah, that's really long. We removed interruptions of 2 minutes or less from the data. And we're calling those non-significant interruptions. And despite that, people still switched every 12 minutes and 18 seconds on average. That's not a lot of time to spend in a working sphere. Then we looked at types of interruptions. Not all interruptions are the same. So we categorized interruptions into internal interruptions and external interruptions. An internal interruption is from the observer's point of view. You're watching someone and for no apparent reason, they suddenly stop what they're doing and shift and do something else, right? They're typing in a Word document and suddenly they go and pick up a phone call, right? Or in a cubicle, someone starts chatting through the wall. That's a self-interruption, an internal interruption. An external interruption is anything that has an identifiable external source, right? Someone comes in, the telephone rings, people respond to an email. And what surprised me was just the extent to which people self-interrupt, right? About 44% of all interruptions were self-interruptions. Since working on this, I observed myself self-interrupting all the time. Okay. This is actually some very, very recent work. We found that when people were in cubicles, they had a 64% increase in self-interruptions. And then we also looked at the predictability of external interruptions on subsequent internal interruptions. And we found that there was a significant kind of relationship. There were individual differences, of course, but these were not related to the job role. What this result suggests to me is that there may be a kind of conditioning going on. Now, we need further research to figure this out, but it may well be that people are accustomed to having external interruptions, and as a result, you kind of fall into this pattern. So, as a result, you self-interrupt more. So that's one of the things that we need to look more carefully at. Well, then we looked at co-location. So what we did was we had people we divided them in 3 categories. Those who were within talking or shouting distance of the people with who they most closely collaborated with. Those who were very far distributed, someone is in a different building, on a different floor, in a different city. And then we had a chunk of people in between. We didn't analyze this group in between because we wanted to have sort of a more extreme kind of comparison. What we found, these are all significant results, was that when people are co-located, they spend significantly longer amounts of time in what we call peripheral working spheres. These are working spheres for which they are not accountable. A good example is the person who comes in and asks you to help debug their software, right? It's not a working sphere that you're accountable for or working in, but you're helping out your colleague. People who are co-located, that means people in these cubicle farms or whose offices were within talking or even shouting distances, they were involved in more peripheral working spheres, and they also experienced more interruptions. Okay. Then we looked at the data in terms of resumption of work. So, given that someone has been interrupted or stopped work, how long does it take, and what are the chances that people are going to resume it? So 2 things we did for this analysis. So first of all, we only considered work that was interrupted and resumed on the same day. The reason is because a lot of our informants traveled. so they may not have been in the next day. Could have been a Friday. And it's also not really fair to compare, you know, you might pick up work 2 hours later versus when you have a whole overnight intervening, right? So we decided we'd just look on the same day. And we didn't consider the last hour of work because, you know, if someone's interrupted at 4:50 p.m. and we know they're leaving work at 5, right? They're really not going to have a chance to resume work. So there's good news and bad news. The good news is about 82% of all interrupted work was resumed on the same day. The bad news was that it was resumed in an average of 23 minutes and 15 seconds. Now, for those of you who are really good at remembering numbers, think back to the length of time that people spend in a working sphere before being interrupted. This tells you that people are working in, on the average, of about 2 different working spheres before they go back and resume their work. So what's happening is you're interrupted from your working sphere, you work in another working sphere, and then you switch to another working sphere, and only then do you go back to the original interrupted working sphere, right? See? And people, as a result, the informants reported a high cost of reorienting back to work. It's no wonder, because they're really being distracted, right? It's not that they're just interrupted. You know, we did our, used our heuristic of 2 minutes, right? And we showed that people spend 12 minutes and I think it was 19 seconds or so. But this is much worse than that, right? This is getting involved in a different working sphere, getting involved in another one, and then going back and trying to reorient. Time of day. Okay, this is just kind of showing you what some data looks like of interruptions over the course of the day. We found that working sphere segments are significantly shorter in the morning. So we have about 10 minutes and 72 seconds versus 14 minutes and 40 seconds. And there really was no significant difference in the number of interruptions. When we asked our informants, they say, oh yeah, because you know, I come in the morning to work and I try to take care of things, get them out of the way, so then I can, you know, focus more in the afternoon. Of course, they're not really focusing, but a bit, I suppose. Okay, gender. How many of you believe that women are better at multitasking than men? How many of you believe that men are better at multitasking than women? Oh, come on. Come on, I think there's some more. Okay.
There's a third option.
There's a third option?
Sure, no difference.
But how many of you think there's no difference?
A little help.
Women were better. First of all, a caveat, there were only 6 females in our sample. But I would argue that, yes, there were only 6 females, but we collected a lot of data for each person. So, you know, 3 days of, you know, second by second activity. So here's the results we found. These are all significantly, statistically significant results to the 0.05 level. Females worked in significantly more central and peripheral working spheres than their male counterparts. The central working spheres were those with which people were accountable for. Females experienced fewer interruptions, but also, these were fewer overall interruptions, but fewer self-interruptions, and they were more likely to resume interrupted work on the same day than their male counterparts. Yes, Martha?
I have a question on that. I mean, there's experience peer interactions, talk about the formal interactions, somebody comes by your office, and you get a phone call, right? These are external interruptions.
Yeah.
So, wouldn't that also put perhaps a lack of socialization and integration into the organization? And you're kind of there by yourself, and people don't drop by as often as they do.
It could. It could.
As opposed to it being, I'm doing something to generate this myself.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm just wondering how your data would be if you're looking at an IT environment where the majority are male. And in the other way, the majority are female, how would your data be different?
I don't know, but that's an interesting thought. Now I have a hypothesis as to why this is the case, but if we have a little bit of time, I'd actually like to hear if any of you have hypotheses. Anyone? Okay. So my hypothesis is that these were women in non-traditional working roles for women, right? So they were financial analysts, managers, software developers, and putting this idea together with some of the responses from the interviews, I would conjecture that the women feel that they have to sort of go above and beyond what's required in order to just be perceived as being on a level playing field. Because they have to focus. They feel the other thing is that who's responsible for the kids, right? Who gets called when a kid is sick? And so the women have to focus and make sure they get things done, because when 5 o'clock rolls around, they're often the ones that have to leave. So anyways, it's just a thought, but I've presented this result, and people who are minorities say, this is exactly the same thing for me. I have to go above and beyond just to be perceived as, being equal to my colleagues. Yes?
In no way gainsaying anything that you've just said. It does seem to me that one thing that appears to me to be absent is any evaluation of the quality of work that's being done during these times.
Yeah. You know what? For information work, it is really hard to measure quality.
Sure.
They're not on an assembly line or piecework. You can go to their managers, but that's completely subjective. It's something that we've struggled with for a long time. How can you possibly assess quality? Right? Even number of lines of code, that doesn't mean it's better right now. Yes?
I'm just wondering, even if we go with this sample, let's say all the 16 are software developers.
No, they were varied.
But let's say if they're all software development, how would the data change? The other question is, the sense of collaboration. You're looking at each individual. We define the sphere by individual. What if we define the sphere by 2 individuals collaborating on the same task?
Mm-hmm.
How would that change things?
So, okay. Well, let's talk later about that, because that's kind of an interesting way to look at it. So to look at it from a collaborative perspective. Right. Okay. Yeah.
Integrating multitasking and collaboration.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Was there any difference in the length of time in their current position between the men and women?
I don't know, and I don't know if we. Oh, we should have that data.
The reason
we should have that.
I mean, something like that could perhaps explain, fewer interruptions. If they're more junior, they haven't been at that.
Okay, we do have that data, and I could go back and look at it. I do know that we did look at demographics, and there was no difference. We looked at things like age, IT experience. We may have looked at that, I'm not sure, but it's something we can go back and check. Communication. Let me just present this result, because I find it very curious, and I call it the invariance of informal interaction. And remember I told you that there were people who were co-located, completely distributed, and semi-co-located. And what I find it really interesting is if you just look at the amount of interaction that was coded as informal interaction, that means you're not scheduled in a meeting. We find that irrespective of whether people are co-located or distributed from the colleagues with who they collaborate most closely, it always comes to about 2 hours a day of informal interaction. So I find that very curious. I don't know what to make of this result, but I just find it almost suggests that there's this need that people, they have to have informal interaction in the workplace. Maybe I'll skip this because it's running out of time. Let me talk about an experimental study that we did. So all of our informants kept talking about stress. They kept telling us how stressed they were. And yeah, me too. And I decided to examine this empirically. Is it really the case that people who are interrupted more experience more stress? It may be like Martha points out that maybe people are invigorated when they're interrupted. Maybe it's a challenge. It's interesting for people. So here's what we did. We brought people into a laboratory environment. We gave them an email task. It was basically a task of concerning human resources where they just had to answer a series of questions. They were given an answer list. And so we could assess whether they answered these questions correctly or not. There was a baseline condition where people were not interrupted. And then there was a manipulation where people were interrupted every 2 minutes. They were either interrupted with instant messaging in one condition, and another condition interrupted by telephone. We had 48 participants. And this was a very surprising result for me. Okay. What we did was we timed how long it took for them to finish their task. And what we did was we removed the amount of time that they spent in interruption. So we subtracted that to get the amount of time. We actually found out when people were in the interruption condition, they actually worked faster than when they were not interrupted. We found that people produced less text in their emails. So this could be a reason why they work faster. And there was no difference in errors. Everybody answered I won't say they answered them correctly, but there was no difference in the amount of errors. We also computed a politeness metric, the use of particular polite words in an email message, no difference in that. Yes?
I kind of had a feeling for the first point, I always work with my friends, and then sometimes, so we have a deadline, say something's due on Tuesday and it's Monday. And I think the reason for that is because when you're interrupted, you're doing something else, right? And then within that deadline, you only have 1 hour to finish your work, so you have to finish it within an hour. So isn't that why
so
they
really
actually
focus, yeah.
So they actually do finish faster.
Yeah, yeah.
If you include the time with the interruptions, were the times more or less the same? So you took out the interruption time, right? For this,
Yeah.
you said that they were faster. With the interruptions, was it more or less the same amount of time?
Probably longer.
It would have to be longer. Yeah, I don't know how much longer, and I don't remember that, but it would definitely be longer. Yeah. Okay. We also looked at stress. We used a measure that's called the NASA workload scale, and we found that when people were interrupted, the subjects scored significantly higher in the following dimensions: stress, mental workload, frustration, time, pressure, effort. And this shows that they're highly significant results and significant. So let me just again throw out my conjecture, because I like giving my conjectures on this. I think that people, what's happening is you get into a kind of mode of expecting interruptions. And if you expect that you're going to be interrupted, you're going to speed up your pace of work, right? Because you know you've got finite amount of time resources to accomplish a task. So you're going to speed up to make sure you accomplish it, right? You have a certain thing you want done by the end of the day, right? You're going to speed up if you know you're continually being interrupted. Okay. This is, let me talk about a prototype that we worked on. We had a visitor from Japan, from Fuji Xerox, and he was very interested in multitasking. And we got into a conversation, and he told me about, in Japan, you know, you have these Japanese gardens where you sit there and you're very peaceful, and wouldn't it be nice if, you know, we could take all these stressed Americans and, you know, give them a Japanese garden. So he designed a device, and you see these rocks in this bed of sand, right? These different colored rocks. And basically, we have the sandbox divided into 4 quadrants, and people would simply place each stone represented one of their projects. They defined the project beforehand, and they had fun defining it. Like, you know, this brown one reminds me of a piece of chocolate, and it's going to be a certain project. And they put it in, as they switched projects, they switched the quadrants. So for example, if you're working on a project where you're collaborating with someone else and you want to signal that you want to be interrupted, you place that stone here. And this in turn is going to be captured through image recognition. There was a camera above this sandbox. And then basically people will broadcast their availability to their colleagues. So it's a simple kind of you know, publish subscribe system. And of course these quadrants were used simply to manage private tasks. So we did that, and we did an experiment. I won't go through too many details here because we're running out of time. But we had in one condition, people were multitasking using the Japanese garden along with a chat system versus just using the chat system. And we found that when people used the Japanese garden system, the average number of interruptions was less because they could signal their availability of when they wanted to be interrupted for which particular task. And they sent significantly fewer chat messages involving coordination. Well, they didn't have to because the position of the stones would signal whether they could be interrupted or not. And they also sent significantly fewer messages about the wrong task. Okay, let me switch to this. So where does this all lead? Well, there's a paradox in the way that information systems are designed. They're designed in terms of individual events, right? You open up a Word document, you open up a spreadsheet. They're not designed to support an integration of these discrete events into what we would think of as working spheres. Now I realize that there's some technology that, you know, has been coming out that's trying to address this problem, and I applaud it, right? But we have to think about the adoption of this kind of technology by everybody to be able to integrate individual discrete tasks into working spheres. Why? Because when you're interrupted, right, it's a lot easier to re-enter a working sphere with all of the data available in that working sphere. You don't have to search separate places. Where did I put this document? Where did I put this document? It's all in one place along with the people who are associated with that working sphere, right? So we are heading into that direction. And I think that, I think this is the right way to go. Okay? Just a quick mention of study that we've been working on. I mentioned that we're using sensors now as opposed to having an observer with a stopwatch. We had an organization agree to let people cut off email for a period of a week, and we wanted to see what happens with their multitasking. My hypothesis is that they would focus more. If you remove email, they're going to focus longer on working spheres. So we've finished the data collection, haven't begun to analyze it. I'm actually flying out to the field site in August to conduct post-study interviews, and stay tuned, and I'll tell you some of the results. One more thing is we did have people wear sociometric badges. These are badges that can detect, if two people are wearing them, you can detect if people are interacting. And so we do have this data as well, which is, it's a lot of data. Okay. Limitations, we only had one coder at a field site. That's because you need to gain trust. You couldn't have two people observing. We were not allowed to video record. We do expect measurement errors. We assume they're normally distributed. Sometimes you click too fast, sometimes too slow. And of course, there's an issue of generalization. We can only generalize these results to high pressure, high tech organizations where people are involved in multiple tasks, different levels of engagement. Okay? And if you want to read more on it, you can find it here. Thank you.
Thank you.